Hey guys, alright, we are back with another Armchair Historian video, this time Dunkirk, from the German perspective, animated history. Now Dunkirk is certainly a popular event in history, and a lot of people like to correlate it to, had the Germans destroyed the Allied forces at Dunkirk, that it could have turned the war. No. I mean, certainly the amount of troops there were sizable and would have greatly damaged British morale, but the British are still very stubborn, and I think it was only 100,000 British here at Dunkirk, or 100,000 total troops there, which is certainly a lot. However, compared to the amount that would serve in total over the course of the war, it's not that big. So anyways, let's go ahead and dive into it from the German perspective. This is like the opening to the movie Dunkirk, isn't it?
A Heinkel HE-111 medium bomber darts in and out of the mists above the French coast. The pilot squints in a vain attempt to see through the foggy windshield and grits his teeth as anti-aircraft shells pierce the low-hanging clouds below. As the Heinkel settles into its attack run, shrapnel rattles the fuselage. Even with dozens of Royal Navy destroyers filling the air with flak, the civilian ships crowding Dunkirk harbor are an irresistible target for the pilot. The bomb bay doors open directly over the hapless French steamer, from which men spill out into the ocean waters even as certain death awaits them. As the ship is consumed by a seething inferno, the Heinkel disappears back into the fog bank.
I really like that when the bomb dropped and then we got the rain effect. That was really nice.
1940, and the Second World War looks as though it will be over by Christmas. The Manstein Plan had accomplished in weeks what the Schlieffen Plan never could. The Maginot Line had been bypassed, and the impregnable Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael had fallen to a handful of German paratroopers. Generals such as Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel were teaching Europe to flinch at the very mention of panzer tanks.
Rommel's unit was known as the Ghost Division, which advanced so quickly that neither the Allies nor Germans were able to keep track of it. That's not a good thing if even your own side can't keep track of it.
While the Luftwaffe seemed to have no equal in the skies above Belgium and France. On every front, the enemy was either in full retreat or being encircled. The lowland countries, once so troublesome during the Great War, were little more than speed bumps on the road to Paris. At the Battle of Sedan, the Luftwaffe conducted the largest bombing campaign in history, flying nearly 4,000 individual sorties against enemy positions and causing thousands to flee in panic.
Damn.
As the French line collapsed, Army Group A, under General Gerd von Rundstedt, started to drive a massive wedge between the bulk of the French army and the British Expeditionary Force, which had recently landed in Flanders. The offensive was not intended to last long, but the impetuous panzer generals Rommel and Guderian openly defied orders and plunged straight towards the Channel, leaving chaos and devastation in their wake. But the Allies were not content to sit idly by and allow the Germans to encircle them. On May 21st, 2,000 French and British soldiers intercepted two of Rommel's panzer divisions and an SS division at the Battle of Arras. Although briefly startled by the bold move, Rommel quickly rallied his men and forced the Allied troops to retreat under the cover of darkness. Far from delaying the German advance, the counterattack simply encouraged Rommel and Guderian to reach the coast as fast as possible. The German force
so it did what it was not meant to do.
Was like a bull in a china shop, and the Allies were the fly buzzing in its ear, inadvertently causing the ensuing devastation. Meanwhile, as General Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group B, dealt with Belgian resistance to the east, mechanized elements of Army Group A continued thundering west at breakneck speed. Guderian's panzers plowed through two unprepared British divisions on the 19th, capturing vital bridgeheads over the Somme and then swinging north towards Boulogne and Calais. As a result of these decisive maneuvers, German forces had an encirclement at Dunkirk firmly established by the 22nd. Despite this unparalleled advance, the German soldier scarcely had time to dip his aching feet into the soothing waters of the English Channel before British evacuation ships appeared on the horizon. Although Luftwaffe bombers had already destroyed the port facilities, British and French men began lining up on the seawall and beaches of Dunkirk, waiting.
Dunkirk has two seawalls, or moles, on the east and west sides of the harbor. These enormous structures jut out a full mile into the ocean and were effectively indestructible to bombers. Huh. Interesting. That's neat.
To board the boats deployed by the larger ships as they reached the shallow harbor. Initially, the Germans were unconcerned. These were not the mighty battleships of the Royal Navy, but a ragtag assortment of destroyers and transports obviously scraped together last minute to evacuate a few thousand key personnel. But as time wore on, more and more ships started to trickle in, and the trickle became a deluge. Generals and admirals alike began.
There are many reasons why the British didn't send capital ships. It was a shallow water harbor, too shallow even for the destroyers they sent. The RAF would have been unable to simultaneously protect the harbor and the battleships from air attacks, and the Germans eventually set up large batteries in nearby Calais.
Scratching their heads, all pondering the same question: where on earth had the British acquired so many transports? Then, as reports from Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights began to trickle in, the stage was set for one of the most controversial decisions.
Okay, hold on. That was a really cool effect there that they had, like, with the planes fly by. That was really fucking cool. I really like that.
Of the war.
The following is a hypothetical conversation amongst the German High Command. Okay, hypothetical. History, alright.
Die Meldungen sind eindeutig. Die britischen Häfen sind leer. Sie haben jedes Schiff, das schwimmen kann, geschickt, um die Feiglinge in Dunkirk zu retten.
Ihre Moral muss auf einem historischen Tiefstand sein, um eine so verzweifelte Tat zu wagen. Wenn wir jetzt zuschlagen, könnte sie völlig brechen.
Ich stimme zu, wir müssen zuschlagen, solange das Eisen heiß ist. Der Augenblick ist unser.
Nein, ihr beide habt die Armee bereits mehr als einmal mit euren törichten Vorstößen in Gefahr gebracht. Wir hatten seit Beginn dieser Offensive keine Zeit zum Verschnaufen. Und jetzt bitten Sie mich, erschöpfte Männer durch die Sümpfe Flanderns zu treiben? Ich denke, der Erfolg ist Ihnen zu Kopf gestiegen.
Sie leben in der Vergangenheit. Unsere neue Art der Kriegsführung hat sich wieder und wieder bewährt. Hätten Sie es lieber, wenn meine Panzerbesatzungen aussteigen und Schützengräben schaufeln würden?
Ich bin geneigt zu glauben, dass unsere bisherigen Ergebnisse für sich sprechen. Der Feind hat sich wiederholt als unfähig erwiesen, auf unser schnelles Vorrücken zu reagieren. Umgekehrt gibt jede Verzögerung den Briten und Franzosen Zeit, eine Gegenoffensive zu organisieren, wie die ich Utrecht zurückgeschlagen habe.
Sie beschreiten beide ihre Befugnisse. Sie haben viel erreicht. Aber ich weiß, wie dünn unsere Linien geworden sind. Welche Garantie habe ich, dass sich die Franzosen nicht einfach sowieso zurückziehen, während Sie im Kanal spielen?
Mein Führer, das hat doch keinen Sinn. Die Luftwaffe kann mit den Briten fertig werden. Nur ein Wort und meine Fliegertruppen werden sich mit unserem kleinen Problem befassen.
Wirklich? Und wie viele Gefangene haben Ihre Stukas bisher in ihren Pilotenkanzeln weggetragen, Göring?
Sie aus der Luft zu schlachten wird nichts weiter tun, als ihre Entschlossenheit zu festigen. Wenn wir ihnen keinen Ausweg mehr geben, werden sie bis zur letzten Kugel kämpfen.
Einige von Kleists gepanzerten Divisionen haben bereits 50% Verluste erlitten. Was nützt es, diese Schlacht zu gewinnen, wenn sie uns den Krieg gegen Frankreich verliert?
Wir brauchen alle unsere Bodenreserven für den Vorstoß nach Frankreich hinein, aber die französische Luftwaffe ist bereits jetzt kaum mehr als ein Ärgernis. Im Gegensatz zur Armee kann ich Ergebnisse ohne ernsthafte Gefahr für unsere Kampagne garantieren.
Wir können keine weitere Zeit mehr mit dieser Debatte verschwenden. Mein Führer, es liegt an Ihnen. Was sind Ihre Befehle?
On May 24th, the skies above Flanders began to fill with an ever-increasing swarm of German fighters. The whine of their massed propellers almost loud enough to deafen observers below. Göring had won his argument. Army Group A would halt, and the mighty Luftwaffe would bomb Dunkirk and the evacuation fleet into submission. Although the tank crews were grateful for the respite, their officers made no pretense of agreeing with Hitler's new strategy. General Franz Halder wrote in his diary, "The air force on which all hopes are pinned is dependent on the weather." This divergence of views resulted in a tug of war which costs more nerves than it does actual conduct of the operations. However, the battle will be won, this way or that. The reasons behind Hitler's decision to halt the advance of the German armor on May 24th are hotly debated to this day. While good arguments have been made on all sides, a lot of it boils down to sagte, dass sie sagte. And although it's undoubtedly true that Hitler made many crucial errors during the war, his decision to halt the ground forces at Dunkirk was not entirely without merit. The Wehrmacht was in serious danger of becoming a victim of its own success. Their advance had stretched German supply lines and left the panzer divisions short on fuel and ammunition. The men were exhausted, the tanks ill-suited for urban warfare, the infantry lagging behind the armor, and the artillery lagging behind the infantry. It's also worth mentioning that after the war, those German generals who survived the conflict frequently ascribed to Hitler their own mistakes, resulting in even further misinformation regarding Hitler's decision-making. As one example, Panzer General Kleist of Army Group A stated later, "I must say that the English managed to escape that trap in Dunkirk, which I laid only with the personal help of Hitler. The fact of the matter is that the English would have been unable to get into Dunkirk because I had them covered. Then Hitler personally ordered that I should withdraw my troops." When General Kleist met Hitler a few days after the evacuation, he was so furious he dared to remark that a great opportunity had been lost at Dunkirk. Hitler, in a perhaps uncharacteristic display of flippancy, calmly replied, "That may be so, but I did not want to send the tanks into the Flanders marshes. And besides, the British won't come back in this war." Initially, it seemed like Hitler's assumption had merit. The British were fleeing in droves, scrambling aboard their ships while being repeatedly strafed by any Luftwaffe fighters that broke through their air defenses. One German pilot wrote after the war, "I hated Dunkirk. It was just cold-blooded killing. The beaches were jammed with soldiers. I went up and down spraying them with bullets." But as the days wore on, it became clear to observers that, despite Göring's assurances, various factors had drastically limited the effectiveness of the Luftwaffe. The Dunkirk pocket was far enough from German airfields that fighters and dive bombers like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Junkers Ju-87 needed to expend the majority of their fuel just to reach the area. Twin-engine bombers, such as the Heinkel HE-111, had an even shorter flight time, leaving no room for error during attack runs that were already made frustratingly inaccurate due to the thick, low-hanging clouds shrouding the harbor. During dogfights, the Bf-109 proved faster than the British Hawker Hurricane and had much better camouflage. However, German pilots quickly came to hate the Supermarine Spitfire, which had better performance at higher altitudes. But even with the Luftwaffe throwing almost 1,000 fighters and bombers at a foe only mustering half that number, British transport ships...
An additional limiting factor for the RAF was the need to hold many fighters in reserve for home defense purposes.
...continued to slip away through the fog. Furious with the situation, Wehrmacht Commander-in-Chief Walter von Brauchitsch dared to challenge Hitler's decision to restrict the advance of Army Group A. With great reluctance, Hitler actually agreed, rescinding the order on May 26th. Finally let off the leash, Rundstedt immediately began plans to advance. However, that same day, Army Group B, which had been pincering the British from the east, launched a major attack across the Ypres-Comines Canal. Realizing he was faced by a mere 2 divisions, General Fedor von Bock ordered a massive artillery and dive bomber attack, then an advance by 3 of his own divisions. Hectic fighting ensued all along the canal, and for a moment it seemed as if the Germans would successfully break through the British flanks and encircle several battalions of troops. But eventually, the enemy had their backs to the wall, and an account from the battle from the 41st Panzer Corps vividly illustrates the situation. At every position, heavy fighting has developed. In consequence, the Corps has not been able to make any notable headway to the east or northeast. Casualties in personnel and equipment are grievous. The enemy are fighting tenaciously and, to the last man, remain at their posts. If they are shelled out of one position, they shortly reappear in another.
I'm really loving the tank
But despite their fierce defense, the British quickly began falling back. German troops stormed across the canals, only for Royal artillery shells to begin raining down on them. Even so, every soldier knew that they were on the cusp of victory unlike anything the Kaiser could have dreamed of, and they pushed forward with dogged determination. Soon after, the Luftwaffe avenged the sacrifices made by the ground troops when they spent 2 hours bombing and strafing Allied columns as they advanced to retreat across one of only 2 bridges on the Isère Canal. A huge number of British vehicles were either destroyed or abandoned, and subsequent attacks disabled a large portion of their artillery, allowing the German infantry to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Although the British and French were now falling back, advancement on the eastern flank was still hampered by a large concentration of Belgian troops. But unwilling to sacrifice thousands more lives in an obviously futile gesture of defiance, Belgian King Leopold III, who was himself commanding troops, agreed to an unconditional surrender.
I forget the Belgians still had a king. And he led the troops himself.
On the afternoon of the 28th. Taking advantage of this situation, von Bock ordered a swift advance, managing to catch 3 British divisions by surprise as they attempted to reposition. The eastern flank was now in disarray, with British lines slowly but surely falling back before the seemingly unstoppable German war machine. Meanwhile, on the western flank, Rundstedt had required nearly 16 hours to prepare for his own offensive maneuvers. Early on the 27th, he had sent the panzers surging forward across the Aa Canal. Results were immediate, with Erwin Rommel brilliantly outmaneuvering the retreating French forces and isolating nearly 35,000 men in the town of Lille. The jaws of the German trap were now closing shut, driving the Allies back to a defensive line a mere 7 miles or 11 kilometers from the coast, with Dunkirk at the center. Throughout this period, the Luftwaffe continued to harass the British evacuation fleet, dropping an estimated 45,000 bombs during its 12 major raids on the Dunkirk pocket.
The weather around Dunkirk was so adverse that there were just 2 days of good flying conditions throughout the entire operation. Damn. The Luftwaffe had much more luck around Lille and Calais, though. Well, yeah.
But for all of Göring's bluster, he proved unable to command the weather, which remained mostly overcast until June 1st. As von Halder put it in his diary, the bad weather has grounded our Air Force, and now we must stand by and watch how countless thousands of the enemy are getting away to England right under our noses. As bullets filled the air over Dunkirk, so too did heated words fill the air back at German high command. Hitler was by now thoroughly fed up with what he saw as an atmosphere of mistrust and insubordination, and took swift action to rectify the situation. Impetuous men like Heinz Guderian were reassigned to the south, while the forces encircling Dunkirk were placed under the control of General Georg von Küchler, whom Hitler regarded as a much more steady and reliable officer. Although Küchler quickly ordered an assault, his lack of familiarity with the new command resulted in a breakdown of communications. In spite of these issues, the Germans achieved a major victory on the first day of June when they finally overran the French force defending the town of Lille.
Well, good for the Germans, not good for, the good guys.
Despite being encircled days earlier, the defenders had required 7 full divisions, or 160,000 men, to fully isolate and contain them. With these
the French at Lille fought so tenaciously that German commander Kurt Weger allowed the men who surrendered to parade past his own troops. This recognition of French bravery earned him a reprimand from high command.
Divisions free to join the main attack, victory was inevitable. Nice. And as the weather cleared, the sky turned black with Luftwaffe planes eager to avenge their fallen comrades. Yet, against all odds, the remaining 40,000 members of the French First Army continued to resist amid the smoking rubble and greeted every German advance with a hail of gunfire. The final French redoubt at Fort de Dune held out until June 3rd, its garrison only surrendering after German bombs had all but leveled the structure. A day later, German forces finally captured the harbor, just in time to watch the last British transport ship steam away into the Channel.
Huh.
As the dust settled, the Germans finally had time to count their losses. Although 20,000 brave men had been sacrificed to collapse the Allied pocket, the enemy had lost 3 times that number, and the Germans had captured at least 100,000 French POWs.
Damn.
Arguments rage to this day over the exact number of planes lost during the engagement, but Göring confidently claimed that his brave pilots had achieved a favorable kill ratio in every encounter and inflicted severe casualties on the evacuation fleet. The Germans also captured a vast quantity of Allied war material. There had been no room on the civilian transport ships for vehicles of any sort, and these now clogged the roads for miles in every direction. Tanks, trucks, armored cars, artillery, and motorcycles, many still fueled and loaded with ordnance. For the rest of the war, vehicles stolen from the British Expeditionary Force would serve in the Wehrmacht on every front, from the scorching deserts of Africa to the coldest depths of Russia.
Huh. After the Battle of Dunkirk, Hitler addressed the German public on the 5th of June. Dunkirk has fallen. 40,000 French and English troops are all that remains of their formerly great armies. Immeasurable quantities of material have been captured. The greatest battle in the history of the world has come to an end. Sure, Hitler, you can think that.
Of course, while Hitler was basking in the adoration of the German public, his officers were lamenting opportunities they believed to have been lost due to his meddling. The Battle of Dunkirk was a German victory, but many in the Wehrmacht remained convinced that it could have been more decisive if their superiors had been willing to take more risks. Even so, as the war raged on, the memories of Dunkirk would linger in the minds of both sides as a great victory. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can see our video.
Well, you know I'm already subscribed, Mr. Armchair Historian. Anyways, that was Dunkirk from the German perspective. Now, this not necessarily was from the German perspective. I mean, they talk about the German perspective, but when I think of telling stories from a certain perspective, you're talking about that information. You're telling that story with the information that they knew at the time, right? That I think is a cool way of doing perspective. That's how I like to look at it. That's how I would prefer it. But this was still a really good video on the evacuation of Dunkirk. And I really like the emphasis on looking at the German officer documents. Now, one thing I do have to say about German general writings after World War II is that they tend to... There could be some problems with them, as they are people trying to separate themselves, as these are generals trying to separate themselves from Hitler. It's in their best interest to separate themselves from Hitler following the end of the war, and to also try and show that they had disagreements with their supreme commander, right? So always kind of put that in the back of your head when you look at, if any of you get into reading books from World War II, written by World War II officers, remember to think about that in the back of your head if you're reading books from former German generals. Because that is certainly a thing that they did a lot, is that they tried to make themselves look better and higher, as if they were not collaborators with fucking Hitler, right? Anyways, that was Dunkirk from the German perspective, animated history by Armchair Historian. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video.